In 455 of the First Age, after 395 years of being besieged, Morgoth's armies once again poured forth from Angband. This would be known as the Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, and while not entirely decisive, it was a major victory for Morgoth. This was a major reversal because in the last few centuries, every attack Morgoth had sent forth had ended in failure. So, what changed? How did Morgoth break the Siege of Angband? Before I start, I do want to say that I have two other videos on this topic, one in my War in Middle-earth series, which is entirely about the battle, and another video where I asked the question, why didn't the Noldor attack Angband? You can consider this video a sequel to that one. Instead of this video being from the perspective of the Noldor, it's from the perspective of Morgoth and what he did differently to score such a major victory over his enemies. Okay, so as you might be aware, the Battle of Sudden Flame was a major victory for Morgoth. He broke the Siege of Angband, his forces overran Dorthonion, his armies ravaged East Beleriand, and eventually managed to push into West Beleriand. Hador, the Lord of the House of Hador, was killed, as was Bregolas, the Lord of the House of Beor, and many of his people. Angrod and Aegnor, the brothers of King Finrod Felagund of Nargothrond, were also killed, and High King Fingolfin would be killed in personal combat with Morgoth shortly afterwards. The Sons of Feanor all survived the battle, but several of them suffered heavy defeats and had to abandon their lands. This was a significant reversal in the war. Previously, Morgoth had lost almost all of his major battles in Beleriand. The first battle ended inconclusively thanks to the arrival of the Noldor. The Dagor Nuin Gwyliath was a major victory for the Noldor, and the Dagor Aglareb that followed saw the destruction of Morgoth's entire army and the beginning of the Siege of Angband. Even during the Siege of Angband, Morgoth did make one major attempt to break the siege, which failed miserably, and Glaurung, the first of the dragons, made an independent attempt afterwards, which saw some minor success before also failing. Thus, Morgoth had to do something different, and he did. Firstly, he practiced patience. In the past, Morgoth had continuously greatly underestimated his foes, either their strength or their vigilance, so the armies he sent forth that he deemed to be strong enough were anything but. As a result, these armies were completely annihilated, doing little damage in the process, and Morgoth then kept finding himself back at square one. This made Morgoth realize that he needed time to become stronger, because he had all of the time in the world. While the Siege of Angband was an annoyance, it didn't genuinely hinder him from building up his own forces. So after 155 of the First Age, after his first attempt to break the Siege of Angband failed, Morgoth launched no new major attacks, and instead decided to build up an absolutely overwhelming force. While this allowed the elves in Beleriand to grow stronger as well, this wasn't an issue for Morgoth because he could build up his forces far quicker. The arrival of men into Beleriand complicated things a little, as men could also grow in number quickly, but fortunately for Morgoth, the three houses of the Edain were relatively few in number, fewer than the elves, and would take a long time before they grew to be a large threat. During this time, Morgoth also worked on fixing another weakness in his army. After his first failed attempt to break the siege, Morgoth realized that orcs alone were not a match for the Noldor, so he began working on new foul creations. It's during this time that dragons were created, the first being Glaurung, and even from Glaurung's own failed attempt to break the siege, we can see how deadly he was. Even though he was half-grown, he punched through the siege, and many fled to Eredwetherin or Dorthonion to escape him. He was only defeated when Prince Fingon led a company of horse archers against him, and Glaurung was forced back by their arrows. It's also possible that trolls were created during this time. They were only mentioned for the first time at the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, so they might not have existed during the earlier battles. Having waited to build a larger army and having supplemented that army with powerful creatures such as dragons, and who knows what else, Morgoth was ready to go. But there was something else that needed changing: his battle strategy. During the Dagor Aglareb, Morgoth had identified Dorthonion as the weakness in Beleriand's defences. The hills there were not particularly steep, and while they were manned by Angrod, Aegnor, and the toughest of the Noldor, they were also the fewest in number. In that battle, Morgoth had relied on being able to overrun Dorthonion before Fingolfin in the west and Maedhros in the east could react. The problem was that Morgoth's armies could be clearly seen the moment they emerged from Angband. Both Maedhros and Fingolfin were ready, and as Morgoth's forces assaulted Dorthonion, they were attacked on either side by Fingolfin and Maedhros, and were utterly destroyed. So, for the Battle of Sudden Flame, Morgoth decided that the best way to stop his enemies from aiding each other was to attack them all at the same time. He was afforded this luxury due to having waited long enough for his armies to grow to such an overwhelming number. Even if he couldn't destroy all of his enemies, he might at least tie up some of the stronger ones, preventing them from aiding the weaker ones. If this sounds familiar, it's similar to Sauron's strategy during the War of the Ring. And funnily enough, Sauron also had to learn the hard way. During the War of the Last Alliance, he attacked only one of his enemies, which allowed the rest of them to unite against him. But the plain of Ard Galan before Angband presented Morgoth with a problem. As I said earlier, Morgoth's armies would be spotted the moment they emerged from Angband, and then they would be harassed as they crossed the plain. This would give his enemies more time to prepare, and he would lose the element of surprise. Fortunately for Morgoth, he had 3 solutions to this problem: the giant volcanic peaks of Thangorodrim above Angband. Morgoth would make them erupt and spew fire across Ard Galan. The smoke and fire would throw his enemies into chaos, while also allowing his armies to move forth under cover and without fear of counterattack. And finally, the timing was important as well. Morgoth decided to wait until winter, when the cold and snow would make it more difficult for his enemies to rally and march on him. On top of that, he decided that the attack should come at night, specifically a night with no moon, while few were awake and the watchfires were burning low. This would allow him to overwhelm those on the plain before they had time to prepare. Okay, so how did this all go? Well, really good for Morgoth, at least at first. On the night of the attack, winter in 455, lava spewed forth from Thangorodrim, and many of those on the plains were burned to death. The rivers of fire reached as far as Eredwethrin and Orthonion, setting fire to the woods on the slopes, sending up smoke that further obscured the vision of the defenders and restricted their movement. Morgoth's armies, led by Glaurung and the Balrogs, came forth behind the fire and initially faced no resistance on the plain of Ard Galan, now Anfalglyph because it had been so horribly burned. The devastation and chaos caused by the fire allowed all of Morgoth's armies to reach their objectives without hindrance. And then the strategy of divide and conquer worked spectacularly. Without help from its allies, Dorthonion was overrun and most of its defenders were killed. In the east, Morgoth's forces, aided by Glaurung, took both Maglor's Gap and the Pass of Aglon and defeated most of the Feanorians, allowing them to access East Beleriand, which was ravaged. While Morgoth didn't make any major gains in the west initially, his forces were successful in defeating attempts to save Dorthonion, made by both Fingolfin and Finrod. While the mountains of Eredwethrin did hold, by 456, Fingolfin, upon seeing the defeat of many of his allies, perceived the situation to be utterly hopeless, which is what persuaded him to make his suicidal challenge to Morgoth. All that said, there were factors that prevented this victory from being completely decisive. While time had allowed Morgoth to grow a huge army, it's said that his patience still failed him in the end, and that he still underestimated the strength and valor of his enemies, especially men. Of course, he did have plenty of success, but it's said that if Morgoth had waited longer, when not sure how long, his forces might have grown so large that he could have defeated all of his enemies in one fell swoop. Another problem for Morgoth is that his broad front strategy did result in heavy losses, such as at the Pass of Aglon held by Celegorm and Curufin. And although Morgoth succeeded in defeating many individual enemies, he failed in completely destroying them. For example, while 4 of the Sons of Feanor were defeated, many of their people managed to flee into other lands, and as a result, the Feanorians were still a major threat. A similar thing happened in Dorthonion. Many of the elven refugees managed to flee to Maedhros at Himring, and many of the non-combatants of the House of Beor managed to flee to Brethil and Dor-Lomin. Finally, while Morgoth did manage to seize some of the major passes into Beleriand, he did fail to capture some of the major fortresses. For example, both Himring and Barad Eithel held firm against Morgoth's armies. Minas Tirith, in the Pass of Sirion, also initially held, but it was captured by Sauron in 457. This opened up West Beleriand to Morgoth's forces, but without the element of surprise and facing fresh enemies in Doriath and Brethil, Morgoth's forces had limited success, and facing mounting losses, it wasn't long before Morgoth pulled back his main armies. His last major assault came in 462 when he attacked Hiflum, but this army was also defeated. In the 10 years that followed, many of Morgoth's territorial gains would be reversed. But make no mistake, nothing I just said should make you think that the Battle of Sudden Flame wasn't a major success for Morgoth. Maybe there were some missed opportunities, but the battle did succeed in breaking the siege, it did succeed in weakening or destroying several different lands, and it resulted in the deaths of some of his fiercest rivals. Yet perhaps the greatest success of the Battle of Sudden Flame for Morgoth did not arrive until 17 years after the battle. As I said earlier in the video, Morgoth's armies grew at a much faster pace than those of the Noldor and the Edain, and although Morgoth's armies had taken enormous losses throughout the campaign, they also dealt serious losses to their enemies, losses that could not be replaced as easily or at all. So when the Easterlings arrived in Beleriand, they were welcomed into the armies of the Feanorians, and while some did remain loyal, many were secretly in service to Morgoth and would end up being traitors of the worst kind. They would reveal their treachery at the height of a future battle. Because just as Morgoth had been forced to change his strategy after the Dagor Aglareb, the Noldor and the Edain decided that they needed to change their strategy after the Dagor Bragollach. Thus, the Union of Maedhros was formed, with the idea that they couldn't just wait for Morgoth to attack again and destroy them one by one as he had done during the Dagor Bragollach. So in 472, the Union marched on Angband to reinstate the siege, conveniently placing all of their forces in one place. Morgoth, now with an overwhelming advantage in power, and having his own servants in the armies of the Feanorians, gladly took the invitation. And during the Neneath Anoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the Union was almost completely destroyed. The North offered no more resistance, and what Morgoth had started when he broke the Siege of Angband was finally complete. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I think my favourite thing about the Dagor Bragollach is that it feels more like a military campaign rather than just a single battle, which shows off the scale of the war and just how much stronger Morgoth's armies had become. If you have any suggestions for other First Age topics, please let me know. Cheers, farewell, and remember, the Battle of Sudden Flame is what happens when you eat too much spicy food.